Welcome to the Life Tracks Podcast. I'm your host, Marvin Bryson. For me, podcasting represents a modern take on oral storytelling traditions. Being born in the very last year of the baby boom, I'm closing in on retirement and have grown comfortable in embracing my role of elder in hopes that future generations might benefit from my experiences. An extra added bonus is that part of my history will also be available for my grandchildren should they want to know more about their pop-pop. As a teen, I landed my first paying gig as a musician. The year was 1979, so I have more than 40 years of stories to share in that venue. My music business background came into play because it informed my first motion picture gig as a music supervisor in 2001. The film was Blue Moon, the late great director Xavier Green's Howard University Fine Arts thesis project. Blue Moon aired on Showtime and marked the debut of notable comedic actress Coco Brown. From there, I focused on motion picture editing, completed a great Avid editing program, and moved to Hollywood. Over the past 20 years, I have compiled over 200 credits on roughly 20 television series and films. So, without further ado, let's get into track one, Falling in Love with Music. Involving the imagination or original ideals is part of the literal definition of creative. As a military kid, I was always in my head, daydreaming of great adventures, being a great athlete, or a famous musician. My first memory of performing was at age 4, maybe 5. I vividly remember changing into my Sunday's best, running downstairs, and singing along with Tom Jones during his opening of his variety show as my family looked on. I don't remember their responses, but can imagine it was a mixture of indifference and disbelief. I do remember loving it, however, and doing it a few more times. The next milestone came at age 7. My brother got a drum set as his Christmas present, with me receiving an electric guitar. My parents encouraged us to perform at their cocktail parties, where we butchered covers of songs like Three Dog Night's Joy to the World. We were living in Dayton, Ohio at the time, where I naturally developed a love for the game of football too. My classmates' team would practice on the field just behind our house. It was torturous for me at the time because my mom wouldn't let me play at such a young age. I remember staring out the window with my nose pressed against the glass, watching practices with envy. I came up in one of those because I said so households and really didn't understand my parents' reasoning. Later, I would come to find that one of my cousins broke his arm playing, so my parents made the decision not to let my brothers and me play organized football until we reached the age of 10. Around 8 years old, we lived near a community center where I would sneak into sound checks of the bands performing there. We lived in North Carolina at the time, so I received a proper introduction to the blue-eyed soul of the Doobie Brothers, Van Morrison, and Steely Dan. As you might imagine, in the mountains of rural North Carolina, there wasn't a lot of funk bands, or even radio for that matter. We got our funk from Soul Train and Don Kushner's rock concert. Being the tender age of 8, it was hard for me to sneak into the building during actual performances. Over the next 2 years, I managed to sneak in a few times, and the energy from the crowd was amazing. From that first moment, I was hooked on music, knowing I had to be in a band someday. Finally, I turned 10 and was allowed to play football. Chances of injuries were small insofar as I turned out to be the biggest kid on the team. I was taught much of the physical and mental commitment of the game from the older kids in my neighborhood. This included my cousins who went on to be both high school and college All-Americans, with one going pro. 1974 rolled around. I turned 11, and my life changed forever when we moved to the Prince George's County suburbs of Washington, D.C. The neighborhood I moved into, Glass Manor, is literally a 25-yard footbridge away from southeast Washington, D.C. The manor's semi-detached homes and apartment complexes were not the hood per se, but just a working-class community and walking distance of some of D.C.'s most notorious projects. Thankfully, at age 11, I wasn't fully aware of the socioeconomics of my situation. Suffice it to say, my surroundings produced a certain mindset that I embraced, but also struggled with from time to time as I grew older. One of the first neighbors I noticed was a young hip cat driving a white Coupe de Ville. He was the American dream with a house, a beautiful wife, and 2 kids, a boy for him and a girl for her. I would later find out he was Joe Quarterman. Joe was known as Sergio, the front man for the group Sergio and Free Soul. The band had a couple of tunes that hit the charts strong enough for them to land on Soul Train's playlist.
Free Soul, and I got so much trouble in my life.
It was surreal to see my neighbor being introduced by Don Cornelius. Joe would turn out to have a profound effect on my life, but we'll get to that later. By the time junior high rolled around, I was running track and playing football, but music was still prominent to me too. I chose a symphonic band class as an elective that was taught by a fresh out of grad school trombone player named Wandale Brown. Mr. Brown played with one of the hottest groups in the city at the time, the Dynamic Corvettes. He had this cool way of saying elementary instead of elementary. Mr. Brown worked us hard and expected results, something I would later mimic in rehearsals with the various bands I played in if it was missing. But he also turned us on to the hottest music technology of the day. I remember clearly when he brought in a mini Moog synthesizer, cutting edge stuff at the time. The synthesizer sound was the driver of Kool and the Gang's hit Summer Madness. I thought learning trumpet would be cool and was assigned to the trumpet section. Being an absolute novice, I started off at the bottom of the pecking order as a third trumpeter, my first experience in working my way up the ladder. It was there I met a guy named Marcus who was a first trumpeter. He took me under his wing and helped me out a lot. We would kick it after sectionals where he turned me on to Funkadelic. They hadn't donned the moniker Parliament Funkadelic as of yet, and were heavy into guitars, basically black rockers as far as we were concerned. A guy named Tony played the baritone horn, but he was also a bass player. We bonded over Funkadelic, Slave, Mother's Finest, or basically any other group with a kick-ass lead guitar over a funky bass line. I told the guys I played too, but I didn't even own a guitar at the time. My mom put one on layaway for me, and as soon as she got it out, Tony Marcus and I got together for a jam session. Even though I had owned a guitar before, I was awful during those first few sessions. So much so that Marcus had to tune my guitar for me. Fortunately, my older sister was dating this guy that lived across the street that also played guitar. Greg agreed to jam with me too, showing me the ropes. So after a few months of jamming with Marcus, Tony, and Greg, I got up to speed. Earned the requisite guitar finger calluses, learned to tune my own guitar, and could actually play a little. Around this time, our middle school's annual talent show was announced. I asked Marcus and Tony if they wanted to start a band. They said yes and recruited a guy named Harold from the drum section. Harold had his own drum kit at home and was good to go. So there I was in a band playing where all these guys were better players than me. The idea of surrounding myself with people that were better and smarter than me was a concept I embraced at an early age. After a few weeks of rehearsal, we settled on Funkadelic's Cosmic Slop from their Hardcore Jollies album as the song we were going to perform. Music folklore has it that the song was recorded in an aircraft hangar live for authenticity. We were without a frontman, so I stepped up to sing, channeling my Tom Jones days. I asked an extroverted friend Paul to sing too, as there were a couple of vocalists on Cosmic Slop. Talent show day came around and we were nervous but ready. The curtain went up. Harold nailed the drum intro. Marcus and I nailed the opening power chords where he had a little riff, and Tony hit his bass line right on cue. We felt like we were killing it until the vocals came up. The PA system we had sucked, and Paul and mine singing wasn't much better. Paul was new and didn't get the vibe that we felt like we were bombing, and threw his sunshades into the crowd. Surprisingly, we rapped to a decent round of applause. After the curtain came down, Tony went off on the verge of tears, saying he was completely embarrassed. I remember just being happy that we pulled off the performance. It would come to be one of many more experiences to come where I'd be paying dues, learning from everything that went wrong on stage.